This is How Tomorrow Works, a series exploring what's next in education, careers, and the workforce. I'm your host, Dan Benjamin, here today with Don Braunstein. Don has been teaching at the University of Phoenix for 13 years. He's made the most of his careers. That's careers, plural. Starting out as a chemical engineer, moving to management, then to publishing, working with notable writers like Kurt Vonnegut, Danielle, Judy, Blume, and then to business education. Don lives in Scottsdale, Arizona, and in addition to teaching, runs a consulting practice. Don, welcome to How Tomorrow Works.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure being here.
Wow. So when you were starting out in chemistry, I'm sure you weren't thinking one day I'll make this huge change. And how do you make that leap?
And once you get an MBA, you can transfer your skills into any industry. Just because you're working in the chemical industry or the oil industry doesn't mean that you can't take those skills and bring it into the publishing industry. I will say that going into the book publishing industry with a chemical engineering background was a little bit different because almost everybody in book publishing has a degree in English literature. But they quickly learned out that I was a reader. And they spread the word. They say, he's okay, he's a reader, it's all right, we can deal with him. I think the most important thing that you can tell people about trying to move up in an organization is to hone their people skills.
Right.
I'll tell you, I was how I learned my own people skills. I was in this first job as a non-engineer, and my boss, who was the controller, called me in and said, hey, Don, do you see the people out in the accounting department? They all hate you. And I said, what do you mean they hate me? And he said, well, when you go to Joe and you ask him for some information, what do? I said, I go to Joe and ask him for the information. He said, well, then what? I said, then he gives it to me. He said, then what? And I said, then I go back to him. He said, well, that's the problem. He said, Joe works for the company, you work for the company. Joe needs to see that you see him as a person, not as a tool that you use and dispose of when you're finished. And so I learned that, and I learned that very well.
It's building these steps as you work your way, not necessarily up from one job to another, but in your personal growth, as you're building that career, you're building yourself.
No question about it. The other thing I learned, and that I think is very important, and that I tell my students, opportunities are going to come your way. When somebody comes to you with an opportunity, jump on it if it's something you think you can do. Don't hesitate. Don't be afraid. Have confidence in yourself.
So Don, I have come up with a little segment here. It's called How Don Works. If you had to be another person for a day, who would it be and why?
Maybe.
It's a tough one.
Maybe Warren Buffett.
Okay. What is your favorite thing about yourself?
I think my favorite thing about myself is that I think I'm smart.
Well, Don, it has been a true pleasure speaking with you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Dan Benjamin. This has been How Tomorrow Works.